Hey students, how are you doing? Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time it may be for you. This is Mr. V's 1301 lecture for the Prelude to the Civil War. I will be talking about some battles, but for the most part, the first, the middle, the turning point, and then the end, like I always do. I may also cover a few. I will remind you that you should watch the Ken Burns movie, The Cause. That is a very, very good comprehensive video that does an excellent job of going over the causes of the Civil War. And let's get something out of the way, okay? I mean, right now, let's just get it out of the way. No ifs, ands, or buts. The Civil War was fought over slavery. Now, I understand that there are some apologists that say that the Civil War was fought over civil rights, but it was over the states' rights, not civil rights, but states' rights, and it was fought over the states' rights to practice what? Slavery. Okay? So, in itself, I don't care what anybody says. We're not going to adhere. I'm not going to adhere to the lost cause, to saying that, that slavery was actually benevolent, that the slaves were actually better in the United States than they were in Africa, yada, yada, yada. No, we're not even going to touch that because all of that has been debunked many, many times historically, and it is not true. And it's simple as that. The Civil War was fought over slavery. End of story. If you choose to believe something else, then that's up to you. Okay? Now, what we're going to see is that after the U.S.-Mexican War, there's going to be a big issue on what are we going to do with the territory that we got from Mexico. Okay, and in 1850, of course, to the Compromise of 1850, we're going to run into the issue of we're going to vote, and California is going to go for popular sovereignty. They did think about cutting it in half, slave and free, but no. They voted for popular sovereignty, that they did not want the institution of slavery in California. Now, what's going to happen is that the true genius of the United States of America is compromise. I mean, this whole country was built on compromise. The Great Compromise, Bill of Rights and Constitution and all of the about. So we have the Missouri Compromise, we have the Compromise of 1850, we have, of course, we're going to have Kansas, Nebraska. And let's talk about Kansas, Nebraska. Okay? So what happens in Kansas and Nebraska is that they also allow popular sovereignty. And what happens there is that what you have is that you have men like John Brown, which in my opinion is the single most important individual in bringing the Civil War to a head. What John Brown would do is that he would go and attack, he attacked the pro-slavery town of Pottawatomie, Kansas, and he literally butchers people. Okay, and then what would happen is that then people from Kansas would go kill anti-slavery people. I think I said butchered anti-slavery people, but that's not correct. He went into Pottawatomie, Kansas, and he killed pro-slavery people. I want to make that sure. And then pro-slavery people went and looked for some anti-slavery people and killed them. And that's just a nutshell of what was going on in Kansas, and they end up calling that Bleeding Kansas. Now, Missouri was a slave state, okay, because of the Missouri Compromise, but there was still a lot of people in Missouri that were against slavery. The further west you get, the more progressive thoughts were, and the less people wanted the existence of slavery. I mean, let me put it this way. I mean, the North didn't want slavery, but at the same time, they did not want African Americans commingling with whites. Okay, I think the question was posed to Lincoln. If it could, would you be okay with an African American marrying your daughter? And from what I understand, he said no. So what Lincoln wanted, Lincoln did not want to abolish slavery. He wanted to contain slavery to its borders. He wanted to keep it in the South. And theoretically, because he was a sharp guy, what would happen is that slavery would die a death of its own. And let me put it to you this way. Slavery was going to die a death of its own. It wasn't going to last forever, because at the end of the day, it's much easier to buy a farming implement like a tractor, okay, than it is to keep people enslaved in order to do the work. It's going to be cheaper to maintain a tractor than it is going to be to maintain slaves, okay? And unfortunately, you have to understand that slaves were seen as property. They were a capital investment. And that's what makes this so horrible. I mean, in the United States, we have the practice of what we call chattel slavery. They couldn't buy themselves out of it. A lot of people say, well, it wasn't the first time we did it. Africans were enslaving Africans and they were selling them. But well, wait a minute. Why were Africans enslaving Africans? Why were, people of the Songhai Empire catching other slaves? Well, because Americans and people from Europe were bringing finished goods. They were bringing guns. They were bringing steel. They were bringing rum. They were bringing those things to Africa, and by bringing those things to Africa, thus created the demand for slaves. All the thing that what slave traders would do is that the more slaves we get us, the more of these things we can get you. And that is, it's a concept of supply and demand. I mean, so I'm not going to completely absolve slaves from capturing other, the people from the empire, the Songhai Empire, capturing slaves and selling them into bondage, but the demand was there. Okay, I mean, it's no secret. Now, with that said, with the slavery was already by the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was already dying. It was already, people were already beginning to realize that it wasn't profitable and it wasn't morally sound to keep individuals in bondage. When you constantly have to make up reasons of why you have to subjugate people, then something is wrong, okay? And with the invention of the cotton gin, that's when we have the second explosion for slavery, because now you can put more land into production. And remember, I talked about this in the lecture of the Era of Good Feelings. Eli Whitney's cotton engine, or cotton gin, is the single most important, in my opinion, of the increase of demand of human beings, or the trafficking of human beings. The largest trafficking of human beings that has ever occurred in the history of the world was the movement of Africans from Africa to the Americas. Okay, be it Brazil was the biggest importer. Then you had the Caribbean, then you had Mexico, and then you had the American colonies, in that order. But the African slave trade has been the biggest mass deportation of movement of human beings that has ever occurred in the face of the history of mankind. Now, it's going to be an issue. I understand that a lot of these Southerners lacked education, or were very conservative in their thought. But the bottom line is that they knew that slavery was bad. They just didn't know what to do. Instead of saying, well, I'm just going to save my pennies and buy some farming equipment, they would do that. And the other thing that happens is that the North will not invest any money in the South because of the institution of slavery. When you look at the railroad lines, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at universities, when you look at all that, the South is really lacking. I mean, these grand mansions that they had were not under any circumstances. They were a facade for the most part. Okay, they were very poorly heated. They were not. The reason they had so many windows is because they had to get ventilated well. They were not, that very few people could live in the Grand Manor. Only 10% of the South owned slaves, and only 3% of the South actually owned more than 10 slaves. At some point, there are some whites in the South that owned slaves, and they're poor themselves. It was just a whole idea of owning another human being that would give them a rise in status. You see what I mean? So what's happening here is that you've got the South dependent on one thing in the economy, and that's cotton. But the cotton had to be sold, as I said before in other lectures, the cotton had to be sold to the North. The raw cotton then would either be turned into a finished textile there and then sold back to the South, or it was sold to England where it was turned into a finished product. And then in England, they would send them goods back to the South, but they would be inflated. Once they would come in, the North would put tariffs on it and would have inflated tariffs. Remember the tariff of abominations. So the South always felt that they were getting the short end of the stick, that they were being bullied by the North. Now, the West didn't really care. Why? Because as long as the West was getting infrastructure built, roads built to move their goods, they were fine, okay? They were okay with it. Just to give you an idea, the gross domestic product of New York City alone was more than the gross domestic product of all of the South combined, okay? So what's going to precipitate the Civil War? Well, the main thing that's going to precipitate the Civil War is the Lincoln election, okay? And I mean, ironically, one of the things that happens is that Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot. I believe it's, don't quote me, but I think it's 7 states that he does not even appear on the ballot. So this is the first election where the South feels that the North elected their president, okay? And when Lincoln was elected, that's when the South really felt that they were threatened, okay? That and the raid at Harper's Ferry by John Brown. The deal with John Brown was that John Brown was a white man willing to kill a white man and start a race war. This was not Frederick Douglass. This was not Nat Turner. This was not, Denmark Vesey. This was not a black man going out and killing white people. This was a white person killing white people, and that was very alarming. They did a lot to the building up of the militias, and then saying, wait, if there's one person that thinks like him, there are more people that think like him. So in my opinion, it's that Harper's Ferry and the election of Lincoln. Of course, the election of Lincoln, you begin to see a wave of secession, and then, of course, Lincoln fires on Sumter, or does the South coax Lincoln to fire on Sumter? I mean, that's a question that did Lincoln start the war, or did the South start the war by forcing Lincoln to fire on them? It's like, you know what, if you're not going to let any supplies come in, then we're going to fire on Fort Sumter, and that is eventually what starts the Civil War. Okay, but the idea here is that when the South actually joins the Union at the beginning, they thought that they could leave at any time. They thought that it was, if we don't like what's going on, then eventually we can leave and start our own confederation of states. But that's not the way it works. And it is Lincoln that eventually does say that if freeing the slaves will preserve the Union, then free the slaves I shall. And his idea was to create an indestructible Union. When, after the Civil War, when these states come back in and they sign the Articles of Secession, they agree never to secede again. So whenever you hear these secessionary movements of Texas leaving the Union, and that Texas can get split up into 5 states, well, not anymore, okay? At one time they felt that maybe they could to keep the slave power balance in order, but no, that's not going to happen at all, okay? So I want you to pay attention to those things. I want you to pay attention to Kansas, Nebraska, Compromise of 1850, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott State. In the Dred Scott State, not John C. Calhoun. I can't remember his name now. I had a brain fart. Justice Taney. Okay, he was a Catholic appointed by Andrew Jackson. He says uh, the black man is not this is a black man is not entitled to any rights that a white man is entitled to. Okay, a lot of people were saying if we give African Americans freedom, then they're going to be equal to us, and we can't have that. Not me. I'm not saying that we, but they're saying that they can't have it. Okay, so once the Civil War gets started, um, it gets started with a lot of fervor. Okay, you have two waves of secession. You don't need to know who secedes with who, but South Carolina was the first. And what we have then is we'll have a secessionary movement, and then you have the firing on Sumter. And the battles that I want you to know, okay, is of course Manassas or Bull Run. Okay, that's the first battle of Manassas, and that is a pivotal battle because the North realizes that the South is not going to be able to uh, uh, be beat that easy. Everybody thinks it's going to take 6 months, and so be it. And it took like almost 5 years. The other thing is, it's really, uh, I hate to say funny because people died, but when the Battle of Bull Run happened, people actually went out on picnics and they watched the battle. And then they begin to see the wounded coming in, and it's like, holy crap, there's maimed bodies and legs. And the South was actually losing. And then, of course, Stonewall Jackson rounds up his troops, and this is where the rebel yell comes up, and they overtake the American troops. The other battle that I want you to know about is that I want you to know about Gettysburg. And Gettysburg is important because what Lee wants to do is that he wants to go up above uh, Washington and come up flank Washington. So he goes up through Pennsylvania and he's going to skirt Washington. Washington's right here. So he's going to come around like this. And he ends up at this little town called Gettysburg. Okay. And on the second, third, and 4th of July, you have one of the most important battles in the history of the world. And it all boils down, actually, in my opinion, to a little place called Little Round Top. And it was a hill that once the South got over that hill, then they would flank the Union, and that was the end of that. Actually, at the time he was a colonel, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain from Maine actually holds that attack, and so be it. Then, of course, you have the Peach Orchard, and you have Pickett's Charge, where Pickett's division is annihilated. You have Devil's Den. That's where John Bell Hood loses his arm, I think. But this was really horrible fighting. Okay, now we also have battles like Antietam, which is the single bloodiest day in American history. More Americans fell on that day than in all the wars combined. You have Cold Harbor, where 20,000 fell in 7 minutes. They didn't die; they fell. Okay, either by wounds or by either dead or wounded. Okay, you also have Fredericksburg, which is also a battle where the Union gets routed. But for the most part, what I want you to remember is that I want you to remember Gettysburg as being the turning point. Gettysburg is like the Saratoga of the American Revolution. Well, Gettysburg is the turning point of that. From then on, pretty much Lee was on the defensive the whole way. The main problem that the Union had is that they couldn't find a good general. Okay, he kept, Lincoln kept firing generals because they were either inept or because they wouldn't do anything. And that was not the case with the South. Okay, the South had very competent generals, very willing to fight. And of course, when Stonewall Jackson is killed by his own men, that is a really big blow to the South. Now, the last battle or incident that I want you to know about is Appomattox Courthouse. That's where Lee surrenders to Grant. Okay, uh, and like I said, I really want you to watch the video. Okay, I want you to watch the video that I put there from Ken Burns, The Cause. I want you to look at your notes. Okay, and for the most part, I think I may have left something out. I mean, I'm pretty sure I always do, but I've done a pretty good job of saturating this with what I want you to know. Now, remember, it may not seem like a lot, but when you look at the Compromise of 1850, there's a lot of components to the Compromise of 1850. There's also incidents like the Brooks Sumner incident. When Senator Brooks canes Senator Sumner. And there's a lot of little things going on. You have Underground Railroad going on. You have Dred Scott decision, one of the worst decisions ever handed down. But I want you to touch on those things and look at the lecture notes. Look at what's highlighted. Watch the Ken Burns film and listen to this lecture, and you should be okay. All right. Well, if there are any questions, make sure you let me know. But for now, I want you all to be kind to each other. I want you to wear your masks. And hopefully all of you can do well on exam 4 and you don't have to take the final. Okay? You all take care. Thank you for watching. And make sure you hit the like button if you like. And even though, share this with your brother or sister or somebody that wants to know a little bit about history. Thank you and so much.